guys? Oh, was that from the storm?
Oh my god, I bet you that it was David.
When most people think of horror, they think of the slasher. Slasher films, if you're not familiar with them, are generally a subset of popular horror cinema that focus almost exclusively on a group of protagonists who are slowly killed off by a central villain. These are the films where you get your Jasons, your Freddys, your Leatherfaces, and so on. And slashers are the most well-known subset of horror for a reason. They've created icons of the industry and routinely draw in massive amounts of fans, usually the teens and young adults of whatever era they're released within. But by the mid-1990s, slashers seem to be on the decline. Nearly all the main slasher franchises had spun their wheels into forgettable trash, and barely any new slashers were hitting with audiences. Enter Wes Craven, director of the original Nightmare on Elm Street and an icon in the horror scene. In 1995, Craven picked up a script from aspiring screenwriter Kevin Williamson titled Scary Movie. The script was a smart meta-commentary on the slasher that modernized the subgenre and was designed specifically for a new generation of kids who'd grown up on the iconic slashers of decades prior. It was a script specially designed for Generation X, and by 1996, the screenplay had been produced, filmed, and released under the retitled name of Scream.
There are certain rules that one must abide by in order to successfully survive a horror movie.
It's hard to understate the impact of Scream on horror, especially on the slasher. The film was a breath of fresh air for the subgenre, one that pushed it into a new era of cultural relevancy and really struck a chord with the youth of its day. But Scream, like the films before it, spawned a never-ending stream of copycat movies. Some good, but many bad. Only a few years later, and the slasher genre had entered back into the same decline Scream had once saved it from. And this time, there wasn't really a recovery. New horror subgenres just took over the market, from torture and gore films like Saw to supernatural films like Paranormal Activity. And the slasher took a bow from the spotlight, one it still hasn't truly come back from, if it even ever will. Yes, there are slashers today, but the vast majority are just remakes or reimaginings of already told stories. And even the original slasher films we get seemed locked in conversation with an era of the past. Where is Gen Z's Scream? And what would that type of slasher even look like? Well, probably a lot like Bodies, Bodies, Bodies. Released in 2022 alongside some of the greatest horror films of the millennium so far, Bodies managed to set itself apart with an impeccable balance of horror and comedy, tight professional filmmaking, and, most importantly for our discussion around the film, a thoughtful exploration of Gen Z culture. In the same way Scream distilled the zeitgeist of youthful 90s America, Bodies does so for the landscape of modern youth culture in the United States. There are a variety of ways the film achieves this central goal, but for the sake of being concise, today we'll examine 3 essential pieces of the film that help make it such a perfect advancement of the slasher. And first is a change that might honestly earn me flack for even labeling this film as a slasher: the absence of a villain. The central twist in Bodies is that there is no mysterious killer, no slasher villain to blame everything on. Instead of Chucky or Pinhead showing up to finish off our final girls at the film's finale, the entire horrific plot is revealed to have been all the result of a simple misunderstanding. The murder of a character named David, which serves as the inciting incident of the film, wasn't a murder at all. Rather, it was an accidental death caused by David himself, who hilariously cut his own throat while trying to pop a champagne bottle with a sword. On the surface, this might just seem like a clever satirical twist on the slasher formula, but it's in fact crucial to how the film operates as a Gen Z version of the slasher. For Gen Z, there really is no boogeyman, no singular villain. Social media and internet access have ensured today's youth see a picture of the world not in rigid lines of good and bad, but as a complex network of systems and flawed people perpetuating broader forms of harm. Bodies explores that reality by depriving viewers of a clear villain on which to blame anything. Instead, we have to reflect on the chaotic events of the film and on the very human mistakes made by the characters throughout that eventually resulted in tragedy. The movie consistently brushes up against massive ills like abuse, climate change, racism, and more, the type of hyper objects that Gen Z have had to grapple with for their entire lives. And in doing so, the film reminds us of a fact that many Gen Zers already know, that it's not the actions of individuals we must fear most, but instead the broader collective failures that aren't so plain to see. see. And this absence of a clear antagonist serves the second major change that Bodies makes to the slasher formula, a shift from plot to character.
I love you, okay?
Often, slashers are predicated on propulsive stories that drive narrative, each kill becoming a means of reaching the next plot beat or set piece. It's become a running joke that slashers feature expendable characters with little in the way of development, merely as a means to advance the body count and move the story. But Bodies challenges that formula. Director Helena Rhine comes from a background in stage performance, and so too does screenwriter Sarah DeLapp. That becomes obvious as the film progresses, with dialogue, character motivations, and interpersonal relationships underscoring every scene. An immense amount of thought has been put into outlining the fractured and complicated friend group around which this film is centered, making character the central focus instead of kills or explosive action scenes, although those definitely make an appearance. And without a central villain to dominate the story, Bodies is able to effectively preoccupy itself instead with in-group paranoia and the slow erosion of character dynamics. On a dime, relationships can sour, or new information can radically change both audience and character perception of members in the group. For instance, the sapphic kiss that opens the film between main characters Sophie and B is recontextualized from a celebratory moment of passionate young love into one of exploitative sexuality, when it eventually comes to light that Sophie has been cheating on and lying to B for the whole film. But how does this focus on character serve the film's commentary on Gen Z? Well, it's important to first note that Gen Z is easily the generation most accustomed to and raised on social media. Now, don't worry, this video isn't some phones are bad propaganda. I'm actually dead in the center of Gen Z myself and quite chronically online. I mean, I have a YouTube channel, but it's undeniable that a reliance on social media and on the internet has had an adverse effect on my generation. There is this very real social media pressure to keep up a performance, one that is unproblematic and picture perfect, not unlike that which is seen in the idyllic opening of Bodies itself. But that performance comes on a communications platform where nastiness thrives, often revealing a darker underbelly to the social media fantasy of what Gen Z is. We commonly find abject toxicity hiding under the veneer of digital performance, and any attempt to hide that toxicity only ever makes it worse. The focus on character in Bodies, specifically on the slow unraveling of relationships and performative identities, clarifies that reality. Despite all their uses of tired phrases like gaslighting or toxic, ones that might frame them as progressive, our central characters pretty much all reveal themselves to be shitty people, at least to some extent. Their understanding of real social issues is surface level at best, especially given their wealthy status. And if they could have only taken a moment and stopped trying to save face amongst themselves, then we have to assume that they might have all made it out alive. B, our protagonist here, who comes from a working class background, is basically the only one who doesn't fall into the type of toxic, chronically online behavior personified in the other characters. In the film's opening, she has even successfully pulled her girlfriend Sophie into what we might read as a more natural and healthy space, signified by lush forest and the absence of technology. And when B does interact with her phone at the film's start, it's only to genuinely care for her mother, who we learn struggles with mental illness. However, B's spot outside the vapid world of our main cast is slowly corrupted. She's dragged into the chaos, and while B is very much an outsider at first, she quickly becomes absorbed by the hectic dynamic of Sophie's friend group. By the movie's conclusion, any hope of repairing the fantasy has been completely destroyed. B and Sophie roll around in the muck and dirty water fighting over a phone, and in her final line, B simply remarks that she has reception, not even explaining that she needs to call for help with that reception. In her desperate mission to fit in and save face with Sophie's friends, B got caught up in their world of self-obsession. Trying to belong and appear valuable, she went along with the group's actions and definitely murdered multiple people along the way. Her final fight with Sophie is less about protecting herself from the supposed killer and more about dragging Sophie for her cheating. She fulfills a desire to become one of the group, yet by the time she understands that desire to be flawed, the point of no return has already been reached. So the story comes as a cautionary tale of what getting swept swept up in toxic self-obsession and the validation of others can do to us. And by focusing on characters over plot, the film is able to best tell this important story about a generation wherein human identities are masked beneath surface level appearances. And this centering of the individual throughout Bodies, Bodies, Bodies leads me to my third and final example of how the film modernizes the slasher. And this one might be hyper-specific, but I think it's nonetheless essential to understanding why this is such an important Gen Z film. I'm talking about the felt impact of unnamed 2020 illness on the story.
Greg went a little rogue, but
In the same way we analyze films of the 2000s onward as post 9/11, we're now going to have to analyze movies from the 2020s and beyond as post illness. And Bodies is undoubtedly one of those post-vid movies. There is an isolation at root in the film, one derived from a world grappling with a widespread disease, even though the 2020 virus isn't mentioned once in the movie. Instead, the presence of a hurricane in the film is the main point from which that isolation flows, as our characters become entirely helpless to the whims of events out of their control. Privilege initially shields them from their circumstances, but when calamity strikes, they find themselves all equally unequipped to deal with their situation. Whatever toxic and self-obsessed attributes they possessed before isolation are compounded by the scenario they find themselves stuck within, and under the weight of their seclusion, our characters implode. It's very telling that a film like Scream is all over the place location-wise. After all, much of the horror in that film comes from a very 90s fear that underneath growing American society, there is a persistent evil, one manifested within the youth that threatens to tear apart the very fabric of American living. And in the same way, it's very telling that Bodies remains in one location throughout. It's a manifestation of a more modern horror that, locked alone in our private, isolated bubbles, we Gen Zers will destroy ourselves from the inside out. When figures of maturity disappear in Bodies, it feels so much more terrifying than it ever did in Scream, because no one can come to take their place. There is no school, no parents, simply the quiet terror of young adulthood and extreme distance from any outside help. If our characters are to make it through the night, it will be entirely on their own. When Scream hit cinemas in 1996, it was a massive success and remains to this day a cultural touchstone beyond even horror. In typical 90s fashion, it was big, it was loud, and it was instantly iconic. Bodies, Bodies, Bodies had a run equally as fitting for its era. The film was praised, talked about on social media for a few weeks, even had its own bit of Twitter controversy, and then quietly faded as the attention economy moved on to something else. And I do find that sad to an extent. The film is a fresh, fun take on horror tropes and conventions, and one of the first movies I've seen that accurately captures Gen Z as a whole. Its characters can be exaggerated, but even then, their exaggeration is largely the point, and never comes at the cost of their believability. That podcast joke is still something I think about daily.
And you build a following. It takes a long time.
However, there is only so sad I can get about the movie's limited shelf life. Bodies is a film for its time, in the same way Scream was a film for its own. And where the 90s are presented as exciting and larger than life, the 2020s have only seemed bland, detached, and aimless. We live in an era where it's increasingly hard to find authenticity, hope, and community. Bodies is a film structured to voice those struggles, to explore the murky depths of what Gen Z really fears. It's paranoid, anxiety-inducing, nihilistic, and topped off with a healthy dose of cynical unseriousness throughout. In other words, it's a damn good film for the 2020s, even if it might be less fun to confront than other horror films of the past. It might not be the movie to save the slasher genre, but in terms of giving my generation a slasher of its own, you'd be hard-pressed to find another quite as good as Bodies, Bodies, Bodies.
Who wants to play Bodies, Bodies, Bodies?
Oh, fuck.
What's up, y'all? I'm doing something very Gen Z right now and recording this outro on my phone. So I hope y'all appreciate the consistency. This angle isn't the most flattering thing in the world. No lighting is up, obviously, but it's something. It's something. So I'm coming on here as usual just to say thank you for watching. This was a video that I had wrote back in summer of 2023, and I really wanted to get it out to you guys and get it filmed. So I'm very happy to have it done now. As always, Patreon is the best place to support me. Give me money over there and you get some extra content. And also my videos early. So you could have seen this video a whole week early, actually. So think about that. Obviously, massive shout out to all my patrons, but a special thank you But a special thank you to my patrons in the shout out tiers. Let me pull up my patrons real quick. All right, special thanks to Flannel Couch, Anya May, Robin, Onyx, Sophie Villarat, Alex Mirabal, and Grace. Also, Adrian_R31. So special thanks to those patrons. And as always, I have been Ellie. You have been wonderful. And until next time, bye.